Hello, everyone. Got a few dirty jokes for you today.
So 3 nuns in church on a hot day decide to remove their robes because of the heat. Not an unusual habit on a hot day. So about a half hour later, the doorbell rings while their robes are slumped over pews clear across the huge chapel. They ask who it is. The blind man, a voice replies. The 3 nuns decide to simply open the door because the man is blind. He walks in, looks at the nuns and says, "Nice body. Where do you want me to install these blinds?" So a primary school teacher was having trouble with one of her students. Frustrated, she asked, "Little Johnny, what is your problem?" Little Johnny replied confidently, "I'm too smart for primary 1. My sister is in primary 3, and I'm smarter than she is. I think I should be in primary 3 too." Curious about his claims, the teacher decided to take little Johnny to the principal's office. While they waited in the outer office, the teacher explained the situation to the principal, who agreed to give the boy a test. He told the teacher that if little Johnny failed to answer any of the questions, he would have to go back to primary 1 and behave. The teacher agreed to the terms. The principal called little Johnny into his office and explained the conditions of the test. Little Johnny nodded eagerly, ready to prove his worth. "All right, let's begin," said the principal. "What is 3 times 3? 9, replied little Johnny without hesitation. "Good. What is 6 times 6? The principal continued. 36. "Little," Johnny answered. The principal continued with questions that any primary 1 student should know. Each time, little Johnny responded correctly, impressing the teacher and the principal alike. After a series of successful answers, the principal turned to the teacher and said, "I think little Johnny can go to primary 3. However, the teacher wasn't finished. "May I ask him some tougher questions?" she requested. Both the principal and little Johnny agreed, eager to see how he would fare. "All right, little Johnny," the teacher began. "What does a cow have 4 of that? I have only 2. "Legs," little Johnny answered confidently. "Good. Now, what is in your pants that you have, but I do not have?" "Pockets," little Johnny replied. "Very clever. Now, what does a dog do that a man steps into?" "Pants," little Johnny shot back. The teacher smiled, realizing little Johnny was keeping up with her. "What starts with a C and ends with a T and is hairy, oval, delicious, and contains thin, whitish liquid?" The principal's eyes opened wide, worried about where this question might lead. "Coconut," said little Johnny. "Great. Now, what goes in hard and pink, then comes out soft and sticky?" "Bubble gum," little Johnny exclaimed, unfazed. "All right. Here's a tricky one. What does a man do standing up, a woman do sitting down, and a dog do on 3 legs?" The principal felt a sense of tension in the room as he braced for the answer. "Shake hands." Little Johnny grinned. The teacher decided to switch to a series of "Who am I?" questions. "You stick your poles inside me. You tie me down to get me up. I get wet before you do. Who am I?" "A tent," little Johnny answered confidently. "Now, a finger goes in me. You fiddle with me when you're bored. The best man always has me first. What am I?" The principal began to feel restless. "A wedding ring," little Johnny said, not missing a beat. "Okay, here's another. I come in many sizes. When I'm not well, I drip. When you blow me, I feel good. What am I?" "A nose," Little Johnny exclaimed, his confidence soaring. All right, last one. I have a stiff shaft. My tip penetrates. I come with a quiver. What am I? An arrow, Little Johnny said, beaming with pride. Now, what word starts with an F and ends in K? That means a lot of excitement. The principal was sweating now, feeling the tension rise. Fire truck, Little Johnny shouted. The principal breathed a sigh of relief, turning to the teacher with a smile. Put this kid in primary 6. I got the last 10 questions all wrong myself. So a farmer stopped by the local mechanic shop to have his truck fixed. They couldn't do it while he waited, so he said he didn't live far and would just walk home. On the way home, he stopped at the hardware store and bought a bucket and a gallon of paint. He then stopped by the poultry store and picked up a couple of chickens and a goose. However, struggling outside the store, he now had a problem how to carry all of his purchases home. While he was scratching his head, he was approached by a little old lady who told him she was lost. She asked, "Can you tell me how to get to 163 Mockingbird Lane?" The farmer said, "Well, as a matter of fact, my farm is very close to that house. I would walk you there, but I can't carry this lot." The old lady suggested, "Why don't you put the can of paint in the bucket? Carry the bucket in one hand, put a chicken under each arm, and carry the goose in your other hand." "Why, thank you very much," he said, and proceeded to walk the old girl home. On the way, he said, "Let's take a shortcut and go down this alley. We'll be there in no time." The little old lady looked him over cautiously, then said, "I am a lonely widow without a husband to defend me. How do I know that when we get in the alley you won't hold me up against the wall, pull up my skirt, and have your way with me?" The farmer said, "Holy smokes, lady. I'm carrying a bucket, a gallon of paint, 2 chickens, and a goose. How in the world could I possibly hold you up against the wall and do that?" The old lady replied, "Set the goose down, cover him with the bucket, put the paint on top of the bucket, and I'll hold the chickens." So, over breakfast, a woman said to her husband, "I bet you don't even know what day this is." "Of course I do," he replied, feigning offense, and headed off to work. By 10 a.m. the doorbell rang. When the woman opened it, she was greeted with a dozen long-stemmed red roses. At 1 p.m., a delivery arrived with a 2-pound box of her favorite chocolates. Then, at 4 p.m., a boutique sent over a designer dress. When her husband came home, the woman rushed over and hugged him. "Thank you so much for the flowers, the chocolates, and the dress," she exclaimed. "You've made this the most wonderful Columbus Day of my entire life." So a woman walks into a bar and orders a whiskey on the rocks. The bartender grabs a glass, scoops up a handful of ice, and starts making the drink. "Wait a minute," the woman says. "I don't know where those hands have been. Could you use the tongs, please?" The bartender gives her a funny look, but shrugs and obliges. A few minutes later, the woman notices a string hanging from the bartender's zipper. "Excuse me," she says. "I don't want to be rude, but you have a string hanging from your zipper." "Oh, that's just so when I go to the bathroom, I can pull it out without having to touch anything. That way, I don't need to wash my hands." The woman nods. I guess that makes sense. She goes back to enjoying her drink, but after a moment, curiosity gets the better of her. "Sorry, I don't mean to pry, but how do you get it back in?" The bartender grins and says, "That's what the tongs are for." So 3 women were sitting around talking about their husband's performance as lovers. The first woman says, "My husband's a marriage counselor. He always brings me flowers and candy before we make love. I really like that." The second woman says, "My husband's a motorcycle mechanic. He likes it rough and even slaps me around a little. I kinda enjoy that." The third woman just shakes her head and says, "My husband's a politician. He just sits on the edge of the bed and tells me how great it's going to be when I finally get it." So an American tourist goes on a trip to China. While there, he's a bit too adventurous and doesn't always use protection. A week after he's back in the States, he wakes up one morning to find his private parts covered in bright green and purple spots. Horrified, he rushes to see a doctor. The doctor, baffled, orders some tests and tells him to come back in 2 days for the results. When the man returns, the doctor looks grim and says, "I've got bad news. You've contracted Mongolian VD. It's incredibly rare and virtually unknown here. We know very little about it." The man, panicked, says, "Well, give me a shot or something, doc. Just fix me up." The doctor sighs. "I'm afraid there's no cure. We'll have to amputate." The man is stunned. "No way. I want a second opinion." "That's your choice," the doctor replies. "But surgery is your only option." Desperate, the man seeks out a Chinese doctor the next day, hoping he'll know more about this rare disease. The Chinese doctor examines him and nods knowingly. "Ah, yes. Mongolian VD. Very rare." "Yeah, I know," the man says. "But what can we do? My American doctor wants to amputate." The Chinese doctor shakes his head, chuckling. "Typical American doctor. Always want to operate. Make more money that way. No need for surgery." The man sighs in relief. "Oh, thank goodness." "Yes," the Chinese doctor says with a smile. "No worry. Just wait 2 weeks. It'll fall off by itself." So an elderly woman walked into the Bank of Canada one morning with a purse full of money. She asked to open a savings account and insisted on speaking directly with the bank president, saying she had a large sum to deposit. After some back and forth, an employee escorted her to the president's office. The president greeted her and asked how much she wanted to deposit. She placed her purse on his desk and replied, $165,000. "Curious," the president asked. "That's a lot of money. How did you manage to save so much?" The elderly woman smiled and said, "I make bets." Surprised, the president asked, "What kind of bets?" "Well," she replied, "I bet you $25,000 that your testicles are square." The president burst out laughing. "That's ridiculous. There's no way you can win a bet like that." Without missing a beat, the woman asked, "So, would you like to take the bet?" "Sure," the president replied, chuckling. "I bet you $25,000 that my testicles are not square." "Done," said the elderly woman. "But given the amount of money, I'd like to come back tomorrow at 10 a.m. with my lawyer as a witness." "Not a problem," said the president confidently. That night, the president grew a bit anxious about the bet. He spent a long time in front of the mirror, examining himself from every angle, checking again and again until he was certain that no one could ever mistake his testicles for square. The next morning, at exactly 10 a.m., the elderly woman arrived with her lawyer. She acknowledged their $25,000 bet and asked the president to drop his pants so she and her lawyer could see clearly. The president, eager to prove her wrong, obliged. She came closer, squinted for a better look, then asked, "Would you mind if I touched them?" "After all, this is a lot of money." "Of course," said the president. I want you to be absolutely sure. The woman gave a little smile as she examined him. Suddenly, the president noticed her lawyer banging his head against the wall. Puzzled, he asked, "Why is your lawyer doing that?" The elderly woman chuckled and said, "Oh, I bet him $100,000 that by 10 a.m. today, I'd have the balls of the President of the Bank of Canada in my hands." So, a woman goes to England for a 2-week company training session. Her husband drives her to the airport and wishes her a good trip. "Thanks, honey," she says. "Anything you'd like me to bring back for you?" He chuckles and replies, "How about an English girl?" She just smiles and heads off. 2 weeks later, he picks her up at the airport and asks, "So, how was the trip?" "Very good, thank you," she replies. "And what about my present?" he says with a wink. "Did you bring me that English girl?" "Oh, that," she replies, smiling sweetly. "Well, I did what I could. Now, we'll just have to wait a few months to see if it's a girl." So a jock and a geek were both applying for the same job. The boss said, "Gentlemen, before I can make a decision, you'll need to take a test." So they took the test, and the next day they came back to find out who got the job. The boss said, "Well, both of you scored the same on the test, but I'm giving the job to the geek." The jock protested, "Isn't that unfair? How come he gets the job?" The boss replied, "Let me explain. Both of your answers were correct all the way through until the last question. The geek wrote, 'I don't know,' but on your paper, you wrote me either." So on their way to get married, a young couple is tragically involved in a fatal car accident. They find themselves outside the pearly gates, waiting for St. Peter to process them into heaven. While they wait, they start to wonder, could they possibly get married in heaven? When St. Peter arrives, they ask him. Says St. Peter, "I've never been asked that before. Let me go find out." And with that, he leaves. The couple sits and waits and waits. Months go by. As they wait, they start to think if they can get married in heaven, should they? After all, eternity is a long time. What if it doesn't work out? They wonder, would we be stuck together forever? After another month, St. Peter finally returns, looking exhausted. "Good news," he says. "You can get married in heaven." "That's wonderful," says the couple. "But we have one more question. If things don't work out, could we also get a divorce in heaven?" St. Peter's face turns red, and he slams his clipboard down. "Are you kidding me?" he shouts. "It took me 3 months to find a priest up here. Do you have any idea how long it'll take me to find a lawyer?" So Fred had been a devout man all his life, and now he was in the hospital near death. His family called their preacher to stand with them during his final moments. As the preacher stood by the bed, Fred's condition suddenly worsened, and he motioned frantically for something to write on. The preacher quickly handed him a pen and a piece of paper. With his last bit of strength, Fred scribbled a note and then passed away. Thinking it best to wait, the preacher slipped the note into his jacket pocket. At the funeral, as he was finishing his message, he realized he was wearing the same jacket. Remembering the note, he said, "You know, Fred handed me a message just before he died. I haven't read it yet, but knowing Fred, I'm sure it's a word of inspiration for us all." He unfolded the note and read out loud, "Hey, you're standing on my oxygen tube." So a man and his ever-nagging wife went on vacation to Jerusalem. Sadly, while they were there, the wife passed away. The undertaker approached the husband and said, "You have two options. I can ship her home for $5,000, or you can bury her here in the Holy Land for just $150. The man thought it over and replied, "I'll have her shipped home." The undertaker asked, "Why would you spend $5,000 to ship her home when it would be so nice to bury her here for only $150? The man answered, "Well, a long time ago, a man died here, was buried, and 3 days later he rose from the dead. I just can't take that chance." So a father returned home from a long business trip to find his son riding a brand new 21-speed mountain bike. "Where did you get the money for that bike?" "It must have cost $300, he asked. "Easy, Dad," little Johnny replied. "I earned it hiking." "Come on, Johnny," the father said. "Tell me the truth." "That is the truth," Johnny insisted. "Every night you were gone, Mom's boss, Mr. Reynolds, would come over. He'd give me a $20 bill and tell me to take a hike." So Paddy had been drinking at his local Dublin pub all day and most of the night, celebrating St. Patrick's Day. "Mick, the bartender, says, 'You won't be drinking anymore tonight, Paddy.' Paddy replies, 'Okay, Mick, I'll be on my way then.' Paddy spins around on his stool and steps off, only to fall flat on his face. He pulls himself up by the stool and dusts himself off. Taking a step towards the door, he falls flat on his face again. Looking at the doorway, he thinks that if he can just get outside for some fresh air, he'll be fine. So, he belly crawls to the door and shimmies up to the door frame. Sticking his head outside, he takes a deep breath of fresh air and feels much better. He takes a step out onto the sidewalk and bam! Falls flat on his face once more. "By Jesus, I'm screwed," he says. Spotting his house just a few doors down, he crawls to the door, hauls himself up the doorframe, opens the door, and shimmies inside. He looks up the stairs and mutters, "No damn way." Instead, he crawls up the stairs to his bedroom door and thinks, "I can make it to the bed." He takes a step into the room and falls flat on his face again. "Screw it," he says, and just falls into bed. The next morning, his wife, Jess, comes into the room carrying a cup of coffee. "Get up, Paddy. Did you have a bit to drink last night?" Paddy replies, "I did, Jess. I was drunk as a skunk." "Bah, how'd you know?" "Mick phoned. You left your wheelchair at the pub." So a man went to a psychiatrist and said, "Doc, I've got a problem. Every time I get into bed, I think there's somebody under it. I'm going crazy." The psychiatrist replied, "Just put yourself in my hands for 1 year. Come talk to me 3 times a week, and we should be able to get rid of those fears." The man asked, "How much do you charge?" $80 per visit, said the doctor. "I'll sleep on it," the man replied. 6 months later, the doctor ran into the same man on the street. "Why didn't you ever come back to discuss those fears?" the psychiatrist asked. "Well," the man said, $80 a visit, 3 times a week for a year is a lot of money. A bartender cured me for $10. And I was so happy to save all that money that I went out and bought myself a new pickup." "Is that so? And how, may I ask, did the bartender cure you?" the doctor inquired. "He told me to cut the legs off the bed. Now there's nobody under there." So a bus full of ugly people was heading to an ugly convention when it crashed through the railings of a bridge, plummeting into the sharp rocks below and killing everyone on board. To their surprise, all the passengers found themselves in heaven. Feeling sympathetic for their struggles with being unattractive, God decided to grant each of them a wish to make up for their difficult lives. The first person stepped forward and said, "I've been ugly my whole life, and people have always teased and mocked me. I wish to be beautiful." God replied, "Done," and instantly transformed the man into a stunning figure. One by one, the others made the same wish, and soon everyone on the bus was beautiful. Finally, God approached the last man, who was laughing uncontrollably. Curious, God asked, "Why are you laughing?" The man grinned and said, "I wish for all of them to be ugly again." So, a man goes to the doctor and says, "Doctor, I have a shooting pain that runs up my right thigh and burns all the way up my back. It's killing me. I can't eat, sleep, or walk. What can I do?" The doctor tells him they need to run some tests. After a week, the man returns, looking worse than ever. "Doctor, I feel like I'm dying. The pain is still shooting up my leg and into my back." The doctor examines the results and says, "Well, the tests didn't show anything conclusive, but based on my experience, I think you need to have your right testicle removed." The man panics and, with wide eyes, asks, "Isn't there any other option?" "I'd be willing to do almost anything." The doctor insists that there's a serious problem with his right testicle, and that if they don't remove it soon, the pain will only get worse. Reluctantly, the man agrees and schedules the surgery. The day before the surgery, he goes to a local clothing store to buy underwear. Frustrated, he asks a young clerk, "Excuse me, can you help me find 10 size 34 underwear? I've been wearing that size all my life, and I can't find it anywhere." The young clerk looks at him and replies, "Sir, you can't be a size 34. You must be at least a size 40. If you wear a size 34, you will feel shooting pain up your thigh and burning in your back." So a farmer went out one day and bought a brand new stud rooster for his chicken coop. The new rooster strutted over to the old rooster and said, "Okay, old-timer, time for you to retire." The old rooster replied, "Come on, you can't possibly handle all these hens. Look what it has done to me. Can't you just let me have the 2 old hens over in the corner?" The young rooster scoffed, "Beat it. You're washed up, and I'm taking over." The old rooster thought for a moment and said, "I tell you what, young stud, I'll race you around the farmhouse. Whoever wins gets exclusive domain over the entire chicken coop." The young rooster laughed. "You really think you stand a chance, old man? Just to be fair, I'll give you a head start." With that, the old rooster took off running. About 15 seconds later, the young rooster sprinted after him. They rounded the front porch of the farmhouse, and the young rooster closed the gap, now just about 5 feet behind the old rooster and gaining fast. Meanwhile, the farmer was sitting on the front porch when he saw the roosters run by. He grabbed his shotgun, and boom, he blew the young rooster to bits. The farmer sadly shook his head and said, "Darn, that's the 3rd gay rooster I bought this month." So last week was my birthday, and I didn't feel very well waking up that morning. I went downstairs for breakfast, hoping my wife would be pleasant and say, "Happy birthday," and possibly have a present for me. As it turned out, she barely said good morning, let alone happy birthday. I thought, well, that's marriage for you, but the kids will remember. When my kids came into breakfast, they didn't say a word either. So, when I left for the office, I was feeling pretty low and somewhat despondent. As I walked into my office, my secretary Jane said, "Good morning, boss. Happy birthday." It felt a little better that at least someone remembered. I worked until 1 o'clock, and then Jane knocked on my door and said, "You know, it's such a beautiful day outside, and it's your birthday. Let's go out to lunch, just you and me." I said, "Thanks, Jane. That's the greatest thing I've heard all day. Let's go." We went to lunch, but we didn't go where we normally would. Instead, we dined at a little place with a private table. We had 2 martinis each, and I enjoyed the meal tremendously. On the way back to the office, Jane said, "You know, it's such a beautiful day, we don't need to go back to the office, do we?" I replied, "I guess not. What do you have in mind?" She said, "Let's go to my apartment." After arriving at her apartment, Jane turned to me and said, "Boss, if you don't mind, I'm going to step into the bedroom for a moment. I'll be right back." "Okay," I nervously replied. She went into the bedroom, and after a couple of minutes, she came out carrying a huge birthday cake, followed by my wife, kids, and dozens of my friends and coworkers, all singing happy birthday. And I just sat there on the couch naked.